Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some 2-for-1 background cards, and I'm going to use Yana's Amaryllis collection. This is a brand new collection, and Yana always knocks it out of the park with her collections. So there's that beautiful Amaryllis die set. There's this poinsettia background press plate, and there's a coordinating stencil that goes with that poinsettia background press plate. And I'm going to concentrate on that press plate and stencil set for this video. There's also a beautiful Amaryllis embossing folder and then a sentiment press plate set that I'm going to be using for sentiments for all of the cards in this video. So I'm going to bring out the poinsettia background press plate. And like I said, most of the cards in this video are going to be using this press plate set. I'm going to use the Yana's Amaryllis die set for my last card. But the great thing about all of the techniques that I'm doing is, well, except for the last card, is you get 2-for-1 background. So you're going to do one technique and you get 2 cards out of it. So I have my press plate on my base of my BetterPress system. I'm using some white mixed media Heavystock, and I'm putting some embossing powder tool over that cardstock before inking up my plate with some VersaMark ink. So this is clear VersaMark ink. I'm going to emboss this background with some clear embossing powder. Now, as you're watching this, if this technique starts to seem familiar, Jennifer McGuire used it recently in a live she did with Heidi from Simon Says Stamp, and she did it with a stamped image. I'm doing it with a BetterPress embossed image. And I figured there's no reason why it couldn't work like this as well as the way she does it. And I was so pleased with results and obviously wanted to share it with you. So I'm embossing that background with some clear embossing powder. I have it in a big container, so it makes it really easy to just pour it over my background. And then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder. Now, obviously, because we're working with clear powder on a white background, it's very hard to see. So I do tilt it in the light regularly to make sure that I'm getting the entire background embossed. And you do want to make sure that you emboss everything. Now, I love that Yana has recently started doing her press plates so that when you press them, the entire background gets pressed. So you could easily do a bunch of different or a variety of different inks on that background, and you can really have fun with those backgrounds. And in this video, I'm going to use it with embossing like I'm doing here, and I'm also going to use it with my Glimmer system to do some hot foiling with it, and I love the result of that as well. So once I have my entire background embossed, I'm going to use the coordinating stencils to place or to color my areas. Now, this first stencil is very hard to place because it's very hard to see the image. I do get it placed, but just know that I left it all in the video here because I wanted you to see if you try to do this technique, even with a different image, and you have a hard time figuring out where that first stencil goes, same. And it does get easier because as you're working on this, you get different areas that are colored in, and it helps you to place those other stencils. So this is the first one that's the hardest. The other ones are really quite easy. So I'm just doing my ink blending or my coloring with Distres ink here. The first color that I'm using is Candied Apple. It's a nice bright red. For my poinsettia, I'm also going to use Lumberjack Plaid, and then I bring in some aged mahogany as well for some deeper ink blending. So I did all of the berries on this layer with that same Candied Apple. Then I'm going in with the Lumberjack Plaid, and this is when I decide that these aren't enough, or it's not quite shaded enough, so I bring in that aged mahogany. And especially for the background layers or the back layers of my poinsettia, I use that aged mahogany at the base of the petal, or where the petal goes behind a petal that's in front of it. Then I'm going to go in with my next stencil, and there's 5 different stencils. I think it's 5, maybe it's 6 in this set. I think it's 6 now. And like I said, after that first one, the other ones are a lot easier to place. For the second stencil here, because I already had that aged mahogany on my brush, I took that ink and I put it in the center of my flowers to get that ink off, but use it on the paper. Rather use it than waste it. Then I did clean my brush off on a scrap piece of paper because I wanted to go back in with some Lumberjack Plaid and I didn't want to have as much of that aged mahogany still on there. For the center petals of my poinsettia here, I'm concentrating with that Candied apple, but I do that Lumberjack Plaid towards the center of my flower. So I always do the darker color towards the center of the flower so that the lighter areas is towards the outside of my petal. That's my preference for doing my stenciling and doing my coloring with my flowers. I always like the darker color towards the base of the petal. After that third stencil there, we can place the next one, and this one has the poinsettia centers as well as a couple acorns. So for the center of the poinsettias, I'm just doing scattered straw. It's a very light yellow. Most of the dots in the center of the flower are embossed with that clear embossing powder. So we're really only going to see a little bit of that color. For my pine cones, I did frayed burlap, and then I used some walnut stain just towards the base of the pine cone just to get some color variation and some shading there as well. For my next one, this one has mostly holly on it, and when I pulled it out, my stencil was flipped in the package. So I had a moment where I wasn't understanding where it went, and then I realized that it was flipped and all was well. So when you're doing your stencils for this image, the number of the stencil, and all of them are numbered, should be at the bottom left of the stencil, and that's a great way to know whether your stencil is the right way or the wrong way. For my holly, I'm starting off with bundled sage, and then I go in with some peeled paint and do a little bit of darker ink blending towards the base of those holly leaves. And you can see how quick and easy it is to color this image because of this layered stencil. And I always love when images have layered stencils that coordinate with them. You can always color without it, but it's fantastic to have that option to be able to color quick and easily with a layering stencil. And I find because of that, you could do many cards if you wanted to mass produce something. That layered stencil set makes it so easy. So anytime there's a layered stencil set that goes with something, I always get it so that I do have that option. The other nice thing about layered stencils, and I'm not doing it for any of the cards in this video, is you can use them with paste or glitter paste if you wanted to add some extra dimension or texture to some areas. Now, before I go on, I'm going to take a paper towel and just blot the top of this. Because that Distress ink gets resisted by that clear embossing powder, if there's any Distress ink somewhere, it's going to just be sitting on that embossing powder. I want to take as much of that off as possible. Now, I let my background there dry for quite a while to make sure that it was good and dry. And then I'm taking another piece of mixed media Heavystock and I'm cutting those pieces or taping those pieces together. So I kind of made a hinge, and I found the easiest way to do it was to do my printed background with the solid piece or the plain piece that doesn't have anything on it, put those two together and then use the tape around it. I used a piece of scrap paper to block off my background there and just used a Distress sprayer to mist my Heavystock that didn't have any ink on it, making sure that that mist totally covered it, but it's not running down. It's just a nice layer of wetness. Folded those two together and put them through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. I'm using plates here that don't have cut marks in them because I didn't want to transfer any of that texture, but it is transferring the color from that Distress ink. You can see it's quite a bit lighter, but it's a fun way to get two backgrounds in one. And if you haven't seen Jennifer's video, I encourage you to watch it because hers looks different than mine simply because hers was a stamped image, so it doesn't have the entire background covered. This one, because that entire background is covered with embossing, I'm getting a clear image of the poinsettias and more of a white solid background. Now, if you look closely at my background here, there is a little bit of transfer of the red ink that must have been on the embossing, but that's totally fine. It still looks absolutely beautiful. I cut those images down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I'm going to use some crimson cardstock as my mat, and those were cut down to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. I'm going to use the sentiment set, and it's called Home for Christmas Sentiments, to do 2 sentiments for these cards. Now, because one of my cards is lighter or paler than the other. I'm going to do one of these sentiments in peeled paint distress ink and one of them in bundled sage distress ink, so that I have two sentiments here that are also different colors. I'm going to use the brighter or the darker of the colors to go on my darker background. I'm going to use the lighter one to go on the lighter background. Another option here would be to do do embossing ink and then emboss the sentiments. That would look absolutely gorgeous as well. I chose to just do some simple distress ink here just to keep things nice and simple. This sentiments press plate set has dies that match all of those sentiments, so I found the coordinating dies, place them on my cardstock here, and I'm just using that Best Ever Craft tape to tape those dies in place. I just did my sentiments on some simple hammer mill cardstock. You could use the same mixed media heavy stock that the image was done in. That would work as well, and because it's a little bit thicker, you'd have more of an impression with that sentiment. I was more interested in getting a clear impression and just being able to read the sentiment and just have a nice sentiment for the front of my card. I wasn't really worried about getting that deep impression that you get with BetterPress. So here are my two cards once they are completely dry. And after you do the technique, you do need to let them completely dry before you assemble your cards together. I'm just using some regular white A2 card bases here. They're going to coordinate beautifully with the white backgrounds on my pieces here. You can see that I didn't even bother taking off that Best Ever Craft tape that I used to tape those pieces together. You could if you wanted, but because this is glued down, it's not in anyone's way and no one's going to even know that it's there other than the fact that I just showed you. Between gluing things in place, I like to put an acrylic block on there just to hold everything down nice and flat while that glue is drying and holding. It also frees up my hands to work on my next piece. And I'm just gluing everything with some with some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. It is perfect for gluing down the sentiments as well as the larger pieces for my cards. I use it all the time for pretty much everything and I really like it. Liquid glue tends to be more inexpensive than tape runners or double-sided tape, as well as the fact that it gives you that wiggle room to move things in place before you're kind of committed to it. So it is great for so many different uses. For the last step for these cards, I wanted to give them just a little bit of extra texture and sparkle. So I'm using some stickles in the center of the poinsettia, and then I'm going to use some glossy accents on the berry clusters. So the stickles are going to give a little bit of sparkle to the center of those poinsettias. The glossy accents are going to make those berries shiny, as well as give them a little bit of dimension. And it just adds a little bit of texture to that background. And using Jennifer's technique here, you can see how quick and easy it is to create two card backgrounds at the same time, basically as creating one. The only thing you have to do is wait for those backgrounds to dry. You could use a heated tool to speed that up faster. It just depends on personal preference, what time you have. Sometimes I have time to wait for things to dry and sometimes I'm not as patient, so I will use my heated tool to dry it. Here I had other things to do around the house, so I just let it dry on its own while I went and got other stuff done. And I absolutely love how that second one with that transfer of the distress ink has kind of a vintagey look to it. So here are these final cards, the first two cards, and you can see the extra texture that those stickles and glossy accents adds to it. For my second set of cards, I'm going to use my Glimmer machine and I'm going to foil that background. I wanted to use some black foil for some nice drama, and this black foil has a matte finish to it, so it's going to look beautiful against the inks that I'm going to use to ink blend it. So I have a hot Glimmer machine here. I put my press plate on it, put the pretty side of that foil against that press plate, and then my hammer mill cardstock and the plates on top. Press the timer button, and once that timer button goes off, I run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, and look at that gorgeous background. You could leave it as is, and it would be absolutely stunning. I'm also going to foil a sentiment, so I already had that ready to go, and I taped everything there in place just to make sure that it wasn't going to shift on me when I transferred from that Glimmer machine to my die cutting machine for the pressure. I'll tuck that aside to cool down before I take that tape off. And then I thought this would look gorgeous solid hot foil. So I took my solid hot foil plate, layered that again, wait for it to get hot because it does take a moment to get hot again. And then once that timer button goes off, once that gets hot enough, I'll put the timer button on and then run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. So once we have that through, we can take the layers up and peel that background off, and look at that gorgeous background. This reminds me of a fabric, and I can't even remember what the name of the fabric is, but in the fabric, that part is velvet, and then you've got a beautiful shiny colored background to it. I absolutely love it. And then while I had the solid hot foil plate out, I did the solid hot foiling of my sentiment so that I would have 2 of these sentiments for these cards. Put that all away once it was cooled, and then we're ready to cut out our sentiments. So I grabbed the coordinating die set, lined everything up, and taped it in place before cutting. Once again, it's always important to tape those in place, especially for sentiments, because you really notice it when they shift. Pull that out, and we have a gorgeous foiled sentiment. I love that matte foil. It kind of looks like it's stamped, but it's not. It has a different look to it. It's just gorgeous. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the solid hot foiled sentiment. Might as well do that while I have my die and everything out. Now, because this black foil has a matte finish to it, I thought the perfect ink to use to color it would be the Cloud9 Interference inks. These, if you've never used them before, have a gorgeous shimmer to them, and they look different on black cardstock than they do on white cardstock. I'm going to do my favorite technique with them with the layering stencil, which is to use some black ink first, wipe it off my stencil, and then use the interference ink. This way I can take advantage of both properties of the ink. You'll see the ink the way it looks on light cardstock, and you're also going to see it the way it looks like on a dark surface, because it's going to go over top of that black ink. It doesn't rehydrate or smear that black ink in any way, but you get both properties of that ink, and it looks absolutely stunning. Between each layering stencil, I am going to take my paper towel and I'm going to blot it just to make sure any excess ink that might be on the foil doesn't get transferred or smeared. So I'm going to repeat those same steps for the first 3 stencils, which are all for the poinsettia. I put that black ink on first, use a dry cloth to get off the excess. I don't want any of that excess black ink to go on my pad. The interference pad color that I'm using here is called Cherry Bomb. So it has a beautiful red on white cardstock, and it's a pinky red, which is absolutely gorgeous. And then it has a little bit more of a purpley tone on the darker ink or the black cardstock. So I love for poinsettias, it's just a perfect shade, and the iridescence to it is absolutely gorgeous. So you see the iridescent shine on both the light as well as the dark, although on the darker areas it shows up a little bit more. If you've never seen these pads before, I have an entire playlist dedicated to them. They, to me, are like magic in a pad. I absolutely love using them, so I use them in a bunch of different ways, so you'll find some more inspiration there. So once again, after each layer, I'm going to use that paper towel to blot off any excess ink. I'm not getting a ton of ink off of there, but I am getting a little bit. The next layer has the poinsettia centers as well as the pine cones. So I'm going to use the black over the entire center of the poinsettia as well as the base of the pine cone. For my poinsettia center, I'm using Sapphire Gold, and this one has a beautiful sapphire color on white cardstock, but it looks more gold on black, which is why I colored that entire center the black ink with black ink before doing it. And then for my pine cones, I'm using Milk Chocolate Roses. This one has a brown tone as well as a bit of a peach tone to it, but it looks gorgeous on those pine cones. For my greenery, I'm using Summer Garden. Once again, going in first with that black ink towards the base of any of those leaves, taking my dry cloth and wiping off that stencil before going in with that interference color. Now for each one of these colors, I have a brush dedicated to it. I took a label maker and labeled each one of these. You could wash these brushes out between uses and let them completely dry. I found that it was easier just to have a brush dedicated to each one, and by labeling them, I know exactly which one is perfect for, or which one is meant for each pad. And because each one of these pads has a different light property and dark property, I don't want to mess those up and get them muddled up on each one of the ink pads. So by having individual brushes for each one of them, for me, that's what works easiest. So the last layer here uses that same Summer Garden interference pad, once again with the black on the where I wanted the color to be a little bit darker, the shaded areas. But look at the interference and the shimmer with that image on that matte background. It is absolutely stunning, and I'm so pleased with the final result. This is how I was hoping it would look, but you know, sometimes you have an idea in your head and it doesn't really turn out the way you had envisioned. This one absolutely did. So I cut that down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I'm going to do the same thing with the solid, and at this point I was still trying to decide if I wanted to add color to this background. I think it would look absolutely gorgeous with color, but I ended up opting not to. For my mats, I cut those to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. I did one in black for that solid background, and then one in white for the background that I had just used the interference to color. I'm going to take that cherry bomb pad and just run it along the outside of that cardstock. This is the easiest way to have a mat that's going to blend and match perfectly. You could go through your cardstock and try to find a color that's going to match, but not only do you have the color match for this, but you also have that shimmer. So it's just beautiful to have that coordinating there. For my sentiment, I could have left it white because I am doing this on a white card base, but it kind of looked a little bit out of place on that front there. So I took that Summer Garden pad and just did some quick ink blending over top of that sentiment so that it would blend in and coordinate well with that background rather than just kind of sticking out like a sore thumb. Once all of that ink was dried, I'm ready to start gluing them together. So once again, gluing them with that Barely Art glue, putting them on my card base, and you can see that there's not a large mat with this. Because I only did 1/8 inch difference between my image piece and my matte piece, but I wanted to have the focus on that gorgeous poinsettia background. I didn't want to see a ton of the matte around it, and I absolutely love that background. It was almost a shame to cut it up. So next I can glue down my solid hot foiled image, and really this is not a traditional poinsettia background. It's completely out of the norm, off the wall, but it's just so striking with that black and white. I absolutely love it. Then I can glue down that solid hot foiled sentiment there. Now, neither one of these are popped up the sentiments. You could take some cardstock scraps and cut extra or die cut extra pieces to have them have a little bit of dimension. But once again, I wanted the focus to be on those backgrounds, not necessarily on the sentiment. To add texture, I'm adding those stickles again, as well as the glossy accents. It's going to add the sparkle to the poinsettias, and then it's going to add the shine and dimension to the berries. And at this point, I wasn't sure if I was going to do it on the other background, my black and white one. I do end up doing it because this isn't going to add a lot of color. It's just going to add some sparkle and shine, and it's going to give just a little bit more texture to that background. Here is that gorgeous background with that interference ink, and I love tilting it in the light and seeing the shimmer and the shine to it. It's absolutely stunning. And then we have our other background. And now I decided to do the stickles and the glossy accents simply because it was going to add the texture, but it's not going to add any of the shine. And because that foiling has just a matte texture to it, the texture of the glossy accents and stickles really enhance it and just make it look a little bit more interesting. It doesn't take anything away from it, like it doesn't detract from its dramatic appearance, but it does give it a little bit of extra texture. And it's some of those texture that you don't necessarily see when you look at it, but when you tilt it in the light, then you start to see it. And it doesn't really show up on camera here. Now, maybe your mind went where mine went while I was doing those first 2 cards, wondering what would happen if I took the technique from number 1, or from cards number 1 and 2, but used the inks from cards number 3 and 4. So that's what I did. Off screen, I embossed my BetterPress background again, but I used those interference inks and I used them in exactly the same way as my foiled background. So I used the same colors, the same method with the black soot Distres ink, using that in the darker areas, and did the background. Then I'm using another piece of Mixed Media Heavystock, and this once again was done on Mixed Media Heavystock. Misted that cardstock and then taped them together, misted the cardstock, and then put them through my die cutting machine. So we have some gorgeous backgrounds here, the result. Now I did let them completely dry. The one thing I was curious about was whether the interference properties of the ink were going to show through, and I think they do show through. The shimmer from them is very, very subtle. These interference inks are water reactive, just like Distres inks, which is why I thought it might work. Now, the cool thing about it is you still get a little bit of the shimmer on the transferred image. I don't think it really shows up well on camera, but when you tilt it in the light, you do get some subtle shimmer. It's not over the top or in your face or anything, but it's absolutely gorgeous. There's a little bit less ink transfer with the interference inks than there was with the Distres ink. So the colors are a little bit lighter with this one than there was with the Distres one, but it's absolutely gorgeous. Now I just took some of my scraps to find matte colors for these. So my matte for this one here, this gray one, is the matte shape, or the matte size is 4 inches by 5 1/4. My image piece is cut down to 3 3/4 by 5, just because I didn't have a gray piece that was already or was the right size, or was a little bit bigger. For the other one though, the matte is cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8, and the image piece is 4 inches by 5 1/4. And I absolutely I was so impressed with how these turned out. For the transferred image, I didn't add any stickles or glossy accents. I didn't think it needed it. It had just a beautiful vintage finish to it, and that subtle shimmer from the interference inks was really gorgeous. I didn't want to detract from it. So that one, I did do a horizontal version of it. I changed where my sentiment was just for something a little bit different. I was going to do it with this one as well. However, with this one, when I put the sentiment horizontally, it was going to go right over top of those poinsettias. The transferred image, it didn't, because the transferred image is a mirror image, so there was enough space for it. But it was a lovely surprise finding out that that totally worked. For my last card, I'm going to use the Yana's Amaryllis die set. First here, I'm cutting it out with some hammermill cardstock. Then I'm going to take some press and seal, and I'm just taking a piece of it here to go on that back. I want to take these pieces out, and I want them to be, or to stay exactly where they are in the die set. For the technique that I'm going to use here, I want to know exactly where each piece is. It's just going to make the whole thing a little bit easier. I've done this technique before, or versions of this technique before. So if you've seen them before, this is going to be a bit of a repeat. I change a little bit here, but most of it's fairly similar. But it's just a fun way to fill in the areas of this die set. You could also color them with Copic markers if you want. For the outline of my image, I'm going to use some velvet cardstock here. This has an adhesive back to it. Now, the way I do it is a little bit more challenging. To make it a little bit more easy, instead of doing it this way, you could take this velvet adhesive paper, put it on some black cardstock, and then die cut it. Now, the reason the way I do it is a little bit more challenging is because this cardstock kind of stretches. So it doesn't necessarily keep its shape really easily. By putting this velvet cardstock onto some black cardstock before time, you would still have to use some adhesive to glue it down to the outside, or the outline, or the shadow image, but you're not going to have to worry about the pieces stretching. So if you want to try this technique, I suggest doing it that way first, putting this velvet cardstock onto some black cardstock before die cutting it, just to make it a little bit easier. It does work out in the end. There's very little stretching and very little distortion, but like I said, it's going to be easier if you put this onto some black cardstock. So I don't need any of these inside pieces of this image, so I'm taking them out, tucking them aside. I'm just going to toss them because I can't see any time where I will be using these inside pieces. If you figure you're going to use them for something, you can always save them. Once I have all of those outside pieces out, I can take my adhesive backing off here. And you do want to do it carefully, once again, not to stretch or distort anything. Off screen, I die cut some vellum with the shadow, and this die set, each one of these pieces has a shadow to it as well as the image piece. And this is where you notice that things are a little bit warped. I pick it up and then put it back down to make sure that it's centered on that shadow, and I end up tearing that accidentally, but I can fix it and put it in place later. So with this piece done and on the vellum, I can tuck that to the side and I can start working on the image piece. Now, when I was cutting around that press and seal, because we don't need the excess press and seal around it, I did cut off the stem. We only need the inner parts of the flowers for this. I'm taking a detailed ink blending brush, using some black soot ink, and just inking where I want the shadow for each one of those petals to be. This goes really, really quick, and by keeping this inside the outline part of the die. I know exactly where the shadow should be, as well as the fact that when I go to put these two pieces together, it's going to make it a lot easier to put them together because I'm going to know where each piece is supposed to go, and it's just going to be like putting a puzzle together. Now you could do the next part of this technique without this black soot distress ink, but I really think it enhances it beautifully. I'm also going to put some of that black soot distress ink on the bottom parts of the leaves for this. Now this die set also has a bud section. I'm choosing not to use it for this particular card, but I love the fact that there is a bud and that it's separate so you can pick and choose where you want it to go. Over top of my flowers, I'm using that Cherry Bomb Interference ink pad, and then over my leaves, I'm going to use the Summer Garden Interference pad. So the Cherry Bomb, like I said before, it's going to have like a pinky red on the white cardstock, and on the black ink, it's going to have a little bit more of a purpley tone. On the leaves, we're going to have green on the white cardstock, and then on the black parts of the ink, it's going to have a bit more of a blue shimmer, which is absolutely gorgeous. So now that this velvet piece is on my black background, I can start inserting those pieces of the flowers. I do about 5 sections at a time, putting some glue on there and then lifting up the pieces from the backing of that press and seal and placing it in those sections. And this is where you'll find out whether you distorted your image piece or not. And you can see there is a few areas on this side of the die cut where there's a little bit of excess space. So it was distorted a little bit. It's not too bad though. It actually worked out a lot better than I was fearing at one point. And like I said before, in order to completely eliminate this, put that velvet cardstock onto some black cardstock and then do this. And you could even do this technique with just plain black cardstock, but I really love the texture difference between the velvet cardstock and that interference ink. It has such a rich, luxurious feel to it, and it's absolutely gorgeous. You'll get a similar look with just black cardstock, but I love the differences in the texture. So by working just a few areas at a time, I can make sure that that glue is not going to start drying on me. And even though I'm using liquid glue on top of vellum, I find that that vellum doesn't warp too much. I don't use a ton of glue because I know that vellum hates liquid. So I just use a little bit, just enough to glue those pieces down and not anger the vellum, if you will. So this comes together really, really quickly. And I think one of the reasons why it does come together really quickly is the fact that I have put that press and seal on top of the backing of those pieces that I ink blended. So I know exactly where each and every one of those pieces is meant to go. I don't have to figure out where it's supposed to go. I can just put the glue on and put them in place. This piece here, I had the stamens or the centers of the flowers. They moved a little bit, so they weren't in proper place, but it's really easy to lift them up, put my piece in place, and then put those pieces down. And that's where I can also take that piece that ended up ripping and just insert that. And you'd never even know that that piece ripped off because you have the texture of the velvet. It completely hides all of that. But like I said before, the difference in texture between the shimmer of the interference pad and the luxuriousness of velvet cardstock is absolutely gorgeous. So I do my outline for this with vellum cardstock so that I have a nice solid background to work on and to glue on. But when I go to glue my cards together, it's very subtle. That vellum, you can barely notice it. I'm going to use that Amaryllis embossing folder to emboss my background, just to give it some extra texture to it. I'm not adding any ink to it because I don't want to detract from my gorgeous die cut there. So I'm just using some white hammermill cardstock, doing that embossing and just having it as a textured background. And it's going to complement that die cut beautifully, give it a little bit more texture, but not detract in any way. You could easily take that embossing folder and do different techniques on it, but then I probably wouldn't do as much to the Amaryllis die cut on top. For my mat, I'm just using some black cardstock because I want to pull in the black from my die cut and complement that. It doesn't need to be anything special, and I didn't feel any need to use that velvet cardstock as the mat. The mat itself is very, very small, so you're only seeing a tiny little bit of it. So the mat is cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. My image or my embossed piece here is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And I did emboss a quarter sheet first and then used my trimmer to cut it down to make sure that that embossing folder didn't distort my cardstock in a way anyway. And I do that often where I cut my embossed piece off or down after it's embossed, because sometimes it does distort the cardstock a little bit. I can then glue my Amaryllis down and then add the leaves to it. And that second leaf, where that Amaryllis got distorted or those petals got distorted a tiny little bit, I'm using that leaf to hide some of those areas. Now, even though it wasn't too bad, it was very, very subtle, and I'm probably the only one that would even notice. I just wanted to share with you a way to hide that a little bit. Because I have the dimension of that stem at the bottom here and I want to put my sentiment at the bottom, I'm just using a couple pieces of scrap cardstock that I cut, that die cut for that sentiment out of. I glued those together and then I just cut the two ends off so that I can add some extra dimension to the two sides of that sentiment, but have an open space in the center to go over that stem. And I figured the stem is the perfect place to add that sentiment. You could always add it in a different place if you wanted, but I didn't really love the way that the leaves looked on that stem, and I just wanted to hide it a little bit. So that sentiment was the perfect place to do that. To add just a little tiny bit more texture, I'm going to take some of those stickles and just put it on the stamen in the center of those flowers. It just adds the perfect amount of sparkle, and I absolutely love, once again, the addition of that texture. It's such a rich looking card, and no, that one isn't a 2-for-1 card, but because it was part of the same collection, it just fit in this video. Now we have the rest of the cards. This one is that 2-for-1 embossed background with the interference inks, and once again, I love the vintagey look of the transferred ink. Then we have our foiled and solid hot foiled cards here. The interference inks with that matte solid black foil. There's nothing like it. It's absolutely stunning in person. And then, of course, our first cards where we did the transferred ink technique from Jennifer McGuire, but did it with some Distres inks. Love those cards as well, and the vintagey look of the transferred ink on that one. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you loved Yana's new collection as much as I do. I know I'm going to be using that poinsettia background so often. It's absolutely gorgeous. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate the time you spend here, and I hope you have a fantastic day.